you all for being here. Thank you to Paul and Pavitra for inviting me and organizing this. The book I've just finished is called A History of Desire in India, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. And one of the things I want to do today is really think first in general terms and then maybe go to one case study. But think in general terms about three different ways in which we usually identify desire today. Because one of the questions I get asked all the time is, what do you mean by desire? When you say a history of desire in India, what is your understanding of desire? And I sort of sadistically say, well, I can't define what desire is. And then I never do, and people are, variously upset and exhilarated. So we'll see what happens to all of you at the end of this evening. But what I always find interesting is the way in which not defining desire very much puts pressure on us, because we're so used to and encouraged to being told that we have to define it. And so I want to begin by looking at perhaps three broad ideas that are so deeply associated with the question of desire for us today, but that I think we can put pressure on a little bit by thinking about the various histories of desire in the Indian subcontinent. So I just want to begin with those three, and then I will move on to talking about Ayyappan in particular. So the first thing I want to think about, and this is of course so normal for us to expect, that when we think about desire, we think about the body, right? We cannot imagine a desire that is divorced from the body. We cannot imagine a desire that is not anchored in some way, shape or form by the idea of the human body. And so what's interesting to think about across multiple traditions in the Indian subcontinent is that the body actually is not the only or even the primary locus of desire. And so if we begin with certain Hindu traditions and the god of love, Kama, in various guises, various iconographic forms, Kama is actually, when you use the word embodies love, that's actually exactly the wrong word to use, because Kama doesn't have a body. And this is his entire specialty or USP, his sort of being in the world. Because legend has it that he goes up to Shiva, who is deep in meditation, having renounced the world and saying, I don't want to have anything to do with anybody. And Kama is trying to lure him out of that meditation, because the gods, and we're going to be speaking about the pantheon of Hindu gods a lot today, the gods, as always, up to no good, up to mischief, up to various forms of skullduggery, have sent Kama to lure Shiva out of his penance, out of his meditation, because they need him to produce a child for various reasons that I'll talk about later. And so Kama goes and with this bow and the arrow of flowers shoots an arrow at Shiva and disturbs his penance, distracts him from his meditation. And Shiva opens his third eye, his famous third eye, and is so furious at being disturbed at his meditation that he burns Kama to a cinder and reduces him to ashes. And then Parvati comes running out and says, what have you done? How can you kill Kama? He was just trying to help you. He was trying to help us. He was trying to help the world. The gods had sent him. He wasn't doing it on his own. And so Shiva relents and says, okay, I'll let him live, but he will not have a body. And so all our tales of desire relating to Kama are all separated from the idea of a body. And so this is one of the first things that I want to start talking about today, that we have to try and inhabit a worldview in which desire is not necessarily located in the body. So in other words then, that desire does not automatically translate into acts of genital intercourse. That desire does not automatically translate into the exchange of bodily fluids. It certainly can, but it does not have to. And so just one very sort of early thing we can say about that is that it expands the palette of our desire multifold. We don't have to think only about bodies any longer, right? We can think about chairs, we can think about plants, we can think about buildings, we can think about ideas. And in fact, I'm very interested in what it means to desire ideas and to think about ideas in terms where we only think about bodies right now, right? So Kama is an early and enduring example about how a lot of what are called now Hindu traditions in India separate actually desire from the body. This is a very modern idea. Psychoanalysis in the 20th century, most famously under Sigmund Freud, also says desire is not limited to the body, or to genital acts in the body. And so this was, this is about 15, 16 centuries after we have the first mentions of karma. And so the idea of the bodiless desire, or desire being far bigger than what the body can anchor, is something that we've actually been used to for a long time. If we think then very quickly also about Sufi traditions in India, and Sriram spoke a lot about Bhakti traditions, and the Sufis and the Bhaktis, of course, were closely allied and became an early form of sort of syncretic conversation that luckily continues into India today, even though it is probably under danger and threat even as I speak. The Sufis, as many of you know as well, always compose poems that are hard to read, not because they're difficult to understand, they're actually stunningly gorgeous and wonderful and beautiful and moving, but because the addressee of the poem is always at once both God and the beloved. And so it becomes almost impossible to distinguish which poem is addressed to God and which poem is addressed to the beloved. And one of the reasons for that, as the Sufis themselves talk about through their poetry a lot, is because these two are mapped onto each other. So the beloved becomes like the Lord, and the Lord comes to the poet as accessibly as the beloved. And one thing that is very, very necessary for us to note in all Sufi poetry written in the Indian subcontinent is that the addressee of the love poems written by men are always men. Now, some people say this is because the poems were written in Persian. Persian is a non-gendered language, and so the assumption just becomes male, and there's certainly a lot of linguistic truth to that. But equally, if you read poems by people like Bulle Shah or even Amir Khusro to Nizamuddin, they will often mention the name of their beloved, and the name of their beloved is always male. And so Sufi poetry will not give you one body to latch onto, it will give you at least two, but all the bodies it's going to give you, all the ideas it's going to give you are going to be ideas of love between two men. And there is no apology for it, there is no shame around it. This is freely spoken about and amazingly extolled. I mean, the intensity of the love. When Nizamuddin dies in Delhi, Khusro says, I'm not going to tie up my hair because night has descended on the world. And the veil of his hair becomes the darkness that he lives in from now on. And so this sort of deeply moving poetry, which sort of shuttles between the divine and the human, is also a poetry that moves through the body. So yes, the body of the beloved is important and interesting and enticing, but it's also something that moves beyond it to something much more abstract. That you don't necessarily have a body for the divine, except that the body that you can see in front of you. So the body then, in the Indian subcontinent, has been really relegated to second, third or fourth place when it comes to thinking about desire. That desire has always been much more capacious, has been much more exciting, has been much more plural and multivocal than thinking about it in terms of the body alone and across multiple disciplines. The second thing I want to think about, and remember I'm just sort of talking about three general ideas of how we can put pressure on our current day notions of thinking about desire, right? And the first one was the idea of the body as being the vehicle for desire. And the second is the question of naming or names, and this is becoming increasingly important for us, right? As we sort of absorb ideas and discourses from the US, we sort of are obsessed, in fact, with thinking about, who am I? What is my desire? What is the name of my desire? What if I change my name tomorrow? And this is an entire discourse that is very important and very, very animatedly taking place all around the world today. And what's interesting in and the example I'm going to use is of this dargah. What's interesting in what I call dargah desire is that naming of relationships actually hardly ever happens. So this dargah that I have photos of you here, I don't know how many of you are from Delhi or have lived in Delhi or go to Delhi or have gone to Delhi. If this were an audience in Delhi, I would tell you all to leave right now and go to this tomb and look at it, but it'll take you a while to get there, so you may as well listen to the talk and then go. So this is the tomb of Jamali Kamali in the sort of Mehrauli archaeological park. And the saint who is buried here, this is a dargah, so it obviously commemorates a Sufi saint who is buried there, and outside whose burial place Qawwalis take place to create a sama of followers, and this is very much has been in practice in India for hundreds of years. So the saint who is buried here is called Jamali, and the grave next to Jamali's grave inside this tomb belongs to someone called Kamali. Now when you ask anyone who was Kamali, what was his relationship to Jamali, you're going to get a plethora of answers, right? You're going to get multiple people saying multiple things. Someone will say, oh, he was his brother, right? Some people will say he was his disciple. Some people will say he was a neighbor. Some people will say he was his best friend. One person has actually said to me he was his wife, right? And so there is a way in which the name of the relationship between Jamali and Kamali is fairly unknown. What we do know about the two of them is that they seem to have been closely associated in their lifetimes and are buried next to each other after their death. Now, Jamali Kamali's tomb is in sort of colloquial terms called the Gay Taj Mahal, and it is absolutely stunning on the inside. But what I find interesting about this idea of calling it the Gay Taj Mahal, of course, is it answers the question of who were Jamali and Kamali by saying that they were two lovers, which they could well have been. But I'm more interested in the fact that there could be potentially multiple relationships between them that we don't necessarily name. What I find interesting about this dargah, and it's actually difficult to get inside it because, of course, the Archaeological Survey of India and all its wisdom has it under lock and key. So you've got to make a special application and go specially to see that, and which is virtually an impossibility. So those are just archival photos. But what's interesting about it is on the outside, this image on your left, that's the tomb from the outside. And what's interesting about that tomb is that it has a flat roof. Whereas, as you can see from the roof on the inside, it's a dome. And this is one of those fascinating architectural features in which the outside of the building is different from the inside of the building. And the flat top, if you look at Sufi graves, Muslim graves actually, the flat gravestone belongs to women with nothing else on top. It's the flat gravestone. So in many ways then, the building ceiling on the outside is feminine, if we want to think about that in architectural terms. Inside, the two gravestones that belong to Jamali and Kamali, we know they belong to men because male gravestones have a little pen box on top of the flat gravestone to indicate the saint who wrote poetry or who sort of, created words of wisdom and works of wisdom. And that sort of soars up above the flat top, which is exactly what happens on the ceiling in the inside of the tomb. So there's something extremely androgynous about this tomb because sort of female on the outside and male on the inside. And of course, if we were to say that to anybody today, we would say, oh my God, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm bisexual? Does that mean I need to be transgender or transsexual? And all these, rather than becoming angst-ridden questions for either the builders of this site or the people buried there or the people who continue to worship there, becomes one among a multiplicity of possibilities that they celebrate whenever they go there. And so Jamali and Kamali, possibly lovers, possibly disciple and teacher buried together after the disciple died. The teacher had already been buried there, which by the way is another taboo today, right? How can you have a relationship between a teacher and a student? And so there is a way in which this dargah, and this is not unique by any means, right? Nizamuddin and Khusro buried together, Bulle Shah and Shah Inayat not together but close together, Madholal Hussain, who is Madholal and Shah Hussain, buried together in Lahore, or just north of Lahore. In fact, Hussain fell so madly in love with Madholal that he changed his name to Madholal Hussain. Right? So there's a way in which all these dargahs give us a version of desire that is between two men, but that is not named any particular category by which we can identify it in one particular way alone. And so this to me is fascinating because again, it militates against almost everything that we're encouraged to believe today or talk about today or think about today. And so dargah desire then becomes a very eloquent example of what it means to allow desire to exist in a form that you don't necessarily pigeonhole it into. Can we think about desire between two men, expressed in terms of soaring poetry, expressed in terms of marvelous architecture, without necessarily having to call it by one name or another? And this idea of naming is also extremely capacious in histories in the Indian subcontinent of how we name desire or what names we give to desire. So in addition to bodies, we also have names that are resistant to being pigeonholed into one thing and one thing alone. And the third thing I want to talk about, which is of course related to the first two, is this idea of categorization, which is to say, today in the 21st century, and it has been so for at least 150 years, the minute you use the word desire or think about desire, your first thought is a particular category of sexual identity. So the minute you say desire, you think about heterosexuality or homosexuality or bisexuality or transsexuality or any number of the million new terms that have come up now. And what's fascinating to me is not because allied to the idea of not having single names for single desires, that categorization of desire simply did not exist the way we are encouraged to think about it today. And so I like to joke, of course, these are stills from Khajuraho, I like to joke that almost all these sculptural positions from Hindu and Jain temples from 800 years ago depict desires that are illegal in India today. Many more of them were illegal till last year. Some of them are less illegal now. But there is a way in which when we think about making progress, desire is one of those fields in which we have regressed alarmingly and amazingly for over centuries. I mean, the Kama Sutra is 1,000 years ago, and now we sort of are too prudish to talk about it. And so the idea of bodies, of names, of categories, of being able to identify and define who we are, and importantly who everybody else is around us, is a way of really shrinking the available horizons of our desires, is a way of shriveling the palette of the multiple tastes that we could otherwise give range to and feed from. And so with these three broad ideas in mind, I want to move to a specific example or a particular example, and that is of the entire Ayyappan controversy that has erupted over the last few months in this country, and that has ensured at least one thing, that people north of the Vindhyas have finally heard about Ayyappan, which actually nobody else has. And I don't know why people would even care now, but it's become an issue, right? All of you are probably familiar with this, but just sort of briefly, you know that in September last year, the Supreme Court, with a 4-1 majority verdict, passed a judgment saying women between the ages of 10 and 50 who had hitherto not been allowed to enter the Sabarimala shrine through the main entrance should now be allowed to make that pilgrimage should they want to, and we cannot prevent them because it's illegal. If any of you has read that judgment or would like to, I would strongly encourage you to. It is an amazingly written judgment. Of course, for all four judges have given separate judgments, but they're all amazing to read. And so after that, as you also remember, there have been outcries, controversies, people saying, how can you allow women to go in? And remember, the age of 10 to 50 is because women are supposed to be menstruating between that age, right? So the idea was menstruating women should not be allowed to walk in through the main steps of the temple for a variety of reasons, some predictable, some less so. The idea that women are dirty when they're menstruating, that they're unclean, that they're going to, and this is my favorite, that they're going to seduce the god, right? That somehow, if you're in menstruating age, that means you're sexually active. If you're sexually active, that means you're going to go into Sabarimala and seduce Ayyappan, right? Someone joked once that there was a time when we expected the gods to look after us, and now we've taken it upon ourselves to look after the gods, right? And so here we are saying, oh my God, we've got to protect Ayyappan from the designs of these evil seductresses who are going to be bleeding and then coming and seducing him, right? And so what is interesting to me, I mean, there are several facets to this, but I won't go into all of them. What is interesting to me about this entire Ayyappan controversy is that the single biggest reason given for preventing menstruating women from entering the shrine through the front is that Ayyappan is a celibate god, right? And you hear this over and over and over again. He's a celibate god, he's a celibate god, he's a celibate god. Fine. What's interesting to me, or puzzling to me, or fascinating to me, is why that assumption of celibacy then makes a further secondary assumption that this God is heterosexual, which is to say, why do they assume that the celibate God is attracted to women? On what basis are they making that assumption? And of course, they make it so fully that they prosecute people on that basis, right? Women are not allowed to enter, and this has only been happening, say, the last 40 or 50 years, not allowed to enter because the assumption is that the celibate God is so nervous about having sexually active women in front of him that we have to protect him from that. And so this assumption of heterosexuality has always bothered me because Ayyappan is one of those gods about whom we know very little. He's not one of the gods who exists really in much of the Puranic literature at all. Comes into being very much as around the time that a Buddhist shrine existed here, and sort of run by tribals of the area, and then gradually, of course, it became Brahmanized, and that's a different story. But anything that we know about the life and times of Ayyappan puts pressure on or militates against this assumption that he might have been attracted to women. And so I'm just going to give you sort of 3 brief stories that allow us to put this pressure on this particular assumption of heterosexuality, not necessarily saying that he is therefore not heterosexual, but to suggest that heterosexuality is not and should not always be the norm, and we are the ones making that assumption when we say someone is heterosexual, whether or not they might be or not. So 3 stories, just briefly I want to tell you. The first is, and this is perhaps the best known story about Ayyappan, is that he's the son of 2 men. His father is Shiva, his mother is Vishnu, in drag as Mohini. And Shiva and Vishnu come together on multiple occasions according to legend. I told you the gods were always up to some skullduggery. Come together on multiple occasions. On this occasion, they have to kill some demon or other. And it's actually more interesting than that. A demon sort of begs Brahma for the boon of immortality, and Brahma says, please, I'm not that stupid, I'm not going to make you immortal. And she says, okay, give me a second boon then, which is that I can be killed only by the son of Shiva and Vishnu. And Brahma says, okay, fine. And then she goes around killing everybody because she can't be killed by anybody. And so Shiva and Vishnu need to come together to produce a child who is going to kill Mahisha. So there are multiple descriptions of this, right? This is a well-known story. And what's interesting is that the South Indian versions of the story are actually much more lurid and juicy and fun than the North Indian versions, which are much more dour and sort of pragmatic, and they needed to have a child, so they did this. But in the South Indian versions, Shiva is hiding in a tree, and this is another story. Another demon has begged Shiva for a boon, that everything he touches will turn to ash. Shiva says, great, go for it. This is the opposite of the Midas touch, right? Not everything I touch will turn to gold, but to ash. But the minute Shiva grants him this boon, the demon runs after him to try and burn him. So Shiva runs and hides in a tree. I love these stories, right? You go climb a tree and hide in a tree. You're only the most powerful god in the universe. And begs Vishnu to come to his aid. Vishnu comes to his aid dressed as Mohini, seduces the demon, and when they're doing their little dance of love, makes the demon touch his own head, which means the demon dies and is reduced to ashes. And so Mohini says, phew, done that, goes, knocks on the tree and says, okay, Shiva, you can come out now, stop hiding, I've done your work for you, right? And Vishnu is back as Vishnu. And so Shiva comes out and says, that's great, but can I please see you as Mohini, because I really want to see how you were able to seduce the demon. So Vishnu says, okay, I get 1,000,000 of these requests every day, but whatever. Takes on his Mohini drag. And remember, Shiva is not under any illusion that this is Mohini or a woman, right? He knows this is Vishnu in drag. And some tales have it that Shiva is so excited by seeing Vishnu as Mohini, so happy that he spills his semen right away, and Ayyappan is born, kills the demon, everyone's happy, and they all live happily ever after, right? So Ayyappan is the son of 2 men. This is a well-known story. Shiva and Vishnu coming together have many other avatars as well, most famously Harihara. But this is a story that has sort of pan-Indian resonance. So that's the first one I want to talk about, that he's the son of two men. The second story that is very interesting and fascinating actually about Ayyappan is that his closest associate, from what we know of what is written about Ayyappan, his BFF, if you will, is a Muslim saint called Vavar. Now again, we don't know what their relationship was. Some say that Vavar was a pirate whom Ayyappan defeated. Some say Ayyappan defeated Vavar, Vavar defeated Ayyappan. Some say they were so equally matched that they said, this is great, just let's sort of live together from now on. And Ayyappan is said to have told his father, the Raja of Pandalam, treat Vavar as myself. This takes us back very much to the discourse around dargahs, about being buried together. Remember, the idea of being together in this life and death is a very romantic trope, right? Forever and ever after, which is what, of course, the dargahs are catering to. And that's what Ayyappan says to his father, that treat Vavar as myself. And this meant that when his father is building Sabarimala to accommodate Ayyappan, he also builds a shrine to Vavar. And if you go to Sabarimala, you are expected to pray at Vavar's shrine before you go to Ayyappan's shrine. So this is one of the few examples in India of a shrine that is utterly, absolutely syncretic, and that has been so from the very beginning. This is not something that's been laid on afterwards, not something that is an afterthought. In its very founding, this was a Hindu and a Muslim, two men deeply attached to one another, being worshipped together. And this is one of those syncretic traditions, and which is also why this prohibition against menstruating women is weird, because this is one of the few temples in India that's actually really open and really capacious, has always admitted people of every single caste. And temples in Kerala, as some of you might know, are notoriously hideous in this regard of caste. And Ayyappan's temple at Sabarimala has always been open. So it's very interesting where some people will give and some people will sort of step back, right? So that's the second story. First, he's the son of two men. Second, he's best friends with a man who's worshipped alongside him because he has described Vavar as himself, as another me to his father. The third story of Ayyappan, which is encapsulated most movingly in actually a Kannada song, is about what happens to Ayyappan after he goes to heaven. So he dies, the shrine is built, he and Vavar go off into the sunset holding hands. Ayyappan goes off to heaven, where, because he is the son of Shiva and Vishnu, he quickly becomes very powerful and is all poised to take over Brahma's seat. Some people actually say he took over Brahma's seat. And the other gods became very agitated because they said, oh, what's happening? This is going to be sort of a family conspiracy. And then Ayyappan does something which agitates the gods even further and drives them and goads them into even more violent action. He decides, I think the world needs to be restructured, so I'm going to do two things and make them law. One is, I'm going to get rid of death. People are not going to die any longer. And the corollary to that is, therefore, that I'm going to get rid of birth. Because you give birth to children because they are sort of bulwarks against your mortality. If you're not going to die, you don't need to create children because you're going to stay alive forever. And so I'm going to get rid of death and I'm going to get rid of birth. We're going to redo the order of the world in which we live. Right? Just as a side note, let me add, and we can talk about this later, is that by getting rid of birth, he is attacking the notion of heterosexuality as necessary. Right? Remember, we are told often, oh, heterosexuality is necessary because you need to reproduce. By getting rid of birth, he's actually attacking heterosexuality at its alleged root, at its very root. So he said, let me get rid of birth and death altogether. The gods get really upset because they say this is going to be a sharp dip in our revenues. Everyone prays to us and gives us diamonds and golds, either when they want a child or when they want to stave off death or illness or disease. And if you're going to get rid of both these things, there's going to be a dip in our bank balance. Right? So they send Narada to Ayyappan to try and somehow, they said, just do it, just go, distract him, make him change his mind, make him forget his scheme, do something please, because we're all in jeopardy. So Narada goes to him and says to Ayyappan, can I have a word with you? And Ayyappan says, look, I'm really busy. I'm abolishing birth and death, so it's going to take some time. So can you, leave me alone for a minute? And Narada said, no, this will just take half a minute. Can you just spare that time? So Ayyappan, polite person, says, okay, what is it? Narada says, I have a very simple question for you. And here it is. How are you related to the wife of your mother and the wife of your father? Ayyappan starts thinking about it and says, how am I related to Shiva's wife and to Vishnu's wife? And legend has it that he was so deep in thought that he actually left the heavens and came down to Sabarimala, lost his seat there and is still there. And as he's thinking, he's saying, okay, maybe Shiva's wife or consort Parvati, who is my father's wife but not my mother, I can call her my stepmother, maybe. But what do I do with Lakshmi? What do I do with Vishnu's partner? How do I describe my father, who is also my mother, who is sometimes a woman and sometimes a man? How do I describe her wife to anybody? And so his dilemma then becomes a dilemma of categorization and naming. How do I name this relationship? And this seems to be only appropriate for someone who is trying to redo the parameters of the world as we know it, who is himself the son of two men, himself trying to get rid of birth and death, is unable to pigeonhole and describe and define with any fixity what his relationship to these four people are. In fact, indeed, he doesn't even know what the answer is to the question of what their genders are. Because you remember also that Vishnu and Lakshmi, Shiva and Parvati often come together in one idol, right? The entire Ardhanarishwara legend is both male and female together. And so this idea, this question puts so much pressure on Ayyappan that legend has it he's still mulling over the matter. He's still thinking about it in Sabarimala. And so for me, the Ayyappan legend is fascinating because it seems to really allow us an alternative way of approaching the pressures we feel today about defining our desires, about naming our desires, about categorizing our desires, about anchoring our desires in certain bodies. And so Ayyappan to me, quite aside from all that brouhaha, is very much the god of men, but that does not make him against women, right? That becomes a completely Brahmanical intervention and invention. So suddenly to say women have to be prevented from going there because he's attracted to them is, to my mind, at the very least, an ignorant statement to make. It may not be incorrect, we have no idea, but it is ignorant of Ayyappan's deep immersion in multiple stories involving male desire, of which he is a complete part. And we want to forget all that, of course, because we want to take all these stories and pigeonhole them into languages that we will understand today. So just very quickly, because I think I have to wrap up now. You already know all these things. This is, of course, the Dargah of Madholal Hussain. Just sort of a quick couple of quotes that I want you to look at, and then I'm going to end. These, of course, all post-date the British, who I feel bad for them, were genuinely horrified when they came to India, right? They could not believe what they were seeing, what they were noticing, what people were doing on a daily basis. And so the battle for India became very much a battle against these types of pluralities and syncretic desires that I've just been talking about. And so the battle for India became simultaneously a political battle and a sexual battle. A battle that had to impose a certain kind of morality in order to gain a certain kind of political ascendancy. And that story about the Nawab of Awadh that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, and it is no coincidence that Awadh was the last princely state to fall to the British, but it's the one they needed the most, and the way in which they demonized it. Some of you may have seen Shatranj Ke Khiladi. I mean, this was their big thing of the sort of decadent Awadhi Nawabs. But what was decadent about them was that they were constantly pushing that boundary between male and female, which was actually a deep and unremarkable facet of multiple histories that they come in and are so horrified by that they have to change. And so when we talk about a history of desire in India today. We are talking about many things, but we're actually not talking about the multiplicity, the syncretism, the plurality, the lack of categorization, the expansion beyond the body, the multiplicity of names that actually are a deep and indelible mark of these histories. What we're talking about instead are in terms of languages of certainty. What we're talking about instead are in terms of languages of definition. And these are very much a 20th and 21st century invention, not in the least bit bearing any resemblance to the centuries of histories, of religions, of philosophies, of literatures, poetries, and art that have predated the shock and horror of the British. Thank you very much, and we can talk more over Q&A.
Just one thought that occurred to me. Would Ayyappan represent some kind of misogyny? Because his birth is between two men. He denies, he wants to get rid of birth and death. Birth is probably the biggest power that women had or made. That's been the tradition, and by denying that, by like getting rid of it, and then so it represented perhaps also a misogynistic tradition, and that's why maybe part of the tradition that women are not welcome to the shrine, because that's a time when they are women really. Otherwise, they're as asexual as anybody else.
Sorry, who is as asexual as anybody?
I mean, women below the age of 10, above 50, I mean, you're not really in the reproductive period.
I would beg to differ. I hope there are many people here over 50 who are deeply sexual. Good.
I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. No, I heard your question. Yeah, sure.
So it could represent a misogynistic tradition. I have to be representative of that.
So there certainly is some credibility to the idea that men promoting the interests of other men is deeply misogynistic. And whether in the boardroom or in marriage rituals, that is regularly the tradition that we see. That men will always prop up other men, denying access of various kinds to women, and that is an extremely misogynistic tradition. Now, one could read the Ayyappan immersion in worlds of men in that tradition, except there is a huge difference to my mind between men promoting other men in order to put women down, which is the sort of heterosexual conundrum, right? Let's keep women in a particular position and promote men. And men promoting other men as being uninvolved with women, which to me is an anti-heterosexual, not a misogynistic position. Because I think I might differ from you a little bit when you suggest that bearing children is women's biggest identifying marker. I think that's what we are encouraged to believe. You're absolutely right about that. And I think we're encouraged to believe that if we don't have children, our lives don't have value. If anything, I'd like to think that Ayyappan would have changed that discourse and allowed women to gain value from so many other parts of our lives that don't have anything to do with producing children. So I can certainly see how there can be a way in which superficially Ayyappan's immersion in men can seem misogynistic, but to my mind it actually is the opposite of that, precisely because it attacks a heterosexual framework which is deeply misogynistic.
So my question has two parts.
Yeah.
I think the first part was sort of just addressing the Persian depiction of homosexuality and men and their sort of love for each other. I think, were the roots purely homosexual, or
what did you say? Were the dudes?
Were the roots?
Were the roots?
Roots of that. Dudes also work.
Yeah. That's why I wondered. Yeah. Yeah. Were the roots?
That, or was it more just the concept of male-to-male friendship being so deeply ingrained in the system? And then secondly, were the Persians completely unique in that ideology, or does that sort of cater downwards toward the Indian segment? Maybe not purely all around homosexuality, but back in the day, what was the equivalent of Persian homosexuality in Indian form?
Yeah. more Persian poetry was written in India than in Persia. So when we're thinking about Persian poetry, India actually outstrips Persia in terms of volume, and also I would add in terms of quality, just because there's so much more to choose from. So we can't in fact separate Persian poetry from India. It very much is an Indic phenomenon. The roots, the dudes, as you put it, of the relationship between two men certainly owes, as I said, to the vagaries of the Persian language, which was fairly unique in the world because non-gendered languages are not that easy to come by. In fact, actually, one of the few major non-gendered languages of the world today is English. And so it is very, because we don't give a gender to nouns. The chair is not, they're all it. And so Hindi, Urdu, all deeply gendered languages. So the fact that it's gender neutral, gender free does contribute a lot to it. The fact that there is an entire discourse, and by the way, this existed between women and male gods as well, and between women too. I think somebody asked Sriram the last time whether there were examples from the Mughal court of women, right, of women poets, and there are many of them, starting from Nur Jahan, Roshanara Begum, all of them identifying themselves as Sufis. And when they write as Sufi poets, it is incredibly sexual, incredibly bodily explicit. They talk about the god touching their nipple and therefore passing the electricity through to them. I mean, it is really quite amazing. So those traditions also exist. So it's not only male-male, though male-male eroticism is perhaps the most. I'm unwilling to call it homosexuality, not because I don't think it is sexual. I think it is deeply erotic, but I think there is always more to it than what we understand today by the term homosexuality. So the sort of equivalent, if you want to think, before Persian poetry came to India, even if we just look at something like the Kama Sutra, which talks in the 2nd century about various categories of desire, right? And Kama Sutra loves categorization. And those of you who haven't read the Kama Sutra, please let me warn you, it's an extremely boring book. It's very boring because the majority of it goes into saying, how you should design your house, which is exciting, but it's not sexual. Where you should put your bed, what color you should paint the walls, this, that, and the other. But when it talks about desire, it really tries to categorize. Except every time that it categorizes, it says, by the way, I'm giving you these categories, but they don't really work. Because there's always something beyond this category. So Vatsyayana's, at least his most famous line in the Kama Sutra, that's my favorite, is he says, passion knows no order. So he will give you all this order and then say it actually defies it. He talks about, in this categorization, what he describes as people of the third nature. People of the third nature, men and women, and he talks about them especially in relation to oral sex. And people of the third nature to him are men who are recipients of oral sex. Performers of oral sex are not, male performers of oral sex are not in this category. People who have anal sex are not in this category. In fact, for Vatsyayana, the only people who have anal sex are heterosexuals. So our understanding of homosexuality and heterosexuality today is much narrower than what either the Kama Sutra traditions or the Persian traditions envisaged more than 1,000 years ago.
There is a little bit I've heard of the Ramayana called the Kritibas Ramayana, in which Ram is supposed to be the son of two women. Can you tell us a bit more about that? The same-sex love between women.
Yeah, I mean, why don't you tell us that story, because I want to talk about other women right now.
I don't know enough to bring it up, except that the word Bhagirath is part of that.
Right. I mean, what's fascinating about these gods and goddesses, I keep saying how fascinated I am by them, is that the goddesses actually never, to go back to the first question too, they never actually reproduce biologically. So the goddesses never have children. It's just some semen spills on a rock and suddenly a child is born. And the sun looks at you with particular ardor and a child is born. And you're feeling bored and you're looking at the mud around your house and you build a child and you say, fine, you've come to life. So the idea of producing children actually, even outside Ayyappan, is quite removed from the heterosexual matrix of a male and a female having to have sex in order to produce a child, right? So these are not unusual stories, right? They're often there. One of the myths that used to abound about two women having children is that the child would be born without bones. That is sort of the only negative myth that I've been able to see about it, but in most other cases, it's absolutely fine. I have actually an entire sort of section in this book which looks at a modern day relationship between two women, which is in a film I hope many of you have seen called Dade Ishqiya. Has anybody seen that? Your lives are not complete if you have not seen Dade Ishqiya, so please go and see it right after this, right? Which is a love story between two women. But we don't know it's a love story between two women because we always want love stories in Bollywood to be between a man and a woman. And so you get all the way to the end of the film, these women are looking deep into each other's eyes, reciting poetry to one another, feeding one another food, and we still think, oh, those men and they are the ones they're in love with, right? So what's fascinating to me about female desire, and even if you think of Deepa Mehta's film Fire, which is very much set in the Ramayana context, right? I mean, the names are also Sita and Sita and Nita. That idea of two women together is often something that flies under the radar, that we don't see explicitly, which means that we are the idiots because they are not preventing us from seeing it, right? We are the ones who don't want to see it. And so those kinds of stories are actually not that unique or unheard of. It's just that we don't like propagating it because we have certain ideas of what women should be.
Just one thing. Just want to know, when did this ban come in Sabarimala?
The ban on women on menstruation.
I thought it was quite recent.
Most people say, well, not most people, it dates from a High Court order in 1965. So it's as recent as that. So when people say, oh, it's a centuries-old tradition, absolutely not true. So dates from a Kerala High Court decision in 65 that actually says, it's so interesting, in its judgment it says, yes, we know women have entered the temple, but we think that they should not from now on. So they sort of code a knowledge that this has been the case, but then they try and stop that. So this idea that it's centuries old and has to do with when Ayyappan's shrine was built in the 11th century is just, pardon my French, bullshit. Yeah.
Was you mentioned the history of India, a desire in India, in terms, you talked about non-rigid genders and sexuality, and that being one of the themes. But was India unique in that aspect? And so, would you know whether India was unique in that aspect? And therefore, if India changed for certain reasons, if we were not unique, why did the rest of the world change as well?
Yeah.
That's really the question.
Yeah. It's a good question. Was India unique? Yes and no. It was not unique in as much as the stories of pantheons of gods, always up to no good, bear startling resemblances and echoes to the pantheons of Greek and Roman gods, all of whom are multiple, all of whom change shape, right? I mean, Hindu gods changing shape all the time, becoming this, that, or the other. Roman and Greek gods did that all the time. So in that sense, these sort of Indic civilizations were not unique at all in this imagination. When you come to sort of the writing of erotic poetry, again, not necessarily unique, because you have a deep tradition even in medieval Europe, especially of women saints writing deeply erotic poetry to God. There starts becoming a huge distinction between the Indic civilizations and what happens in Europe, with a certain kind of institutionalization, sorry sister, of Christianity, right? Okay. So very quickly, medieval Europe, for instance, will institute witch burning, will start sort of hunting down anybody who dares to express same-sex desire. And so you find a startling heterosexualization of literature and art and poetry in Europe starting from about the 13th century. India's great treasure, as far as I'm concerned, is that to this day we continue to have those traditions that we've had. But we're encouraged so much to belittle them, or to ignore them, or to describe them in sort of embarrassed terms as something that is old-fashioned, that we seem to be losing touch with them. So for instance, even the idea of hijras, which we all grew up with, was a fact of our life. We were all taught to respect hijras, no question. And now you have this entire discourse in the West about transgender people, and we never called them that. But now sort of that discourse is taking over, ignoring what the histories of hijras might have been, and trying to impose a different kind of categorization and a nomenclature that is a bit bizarre. And so, yes, I think the more we are entering into this 21st century discourse, which ironically we see as liberatory. And we think it's a liberation if we're able to call ourselves homosexual. Whereas for Vatsyayana, you could be a woman having sex with other women or a man having sex with other men without necessarily calling yourself homosexual, because tomorrow you might want to do something else. And so today the ability to say we are homosexual is seen as a liberation. To my mind, it's actually a signal of a big loss. Because what we have lost is the ability of being more than one thing at one time. And for us, as I said, even till today in certain minority discourses, that does exist as a possibility, but certainly not in the dominant discourse around the world or here.
Fascinating. I never thought what your input you would give. So I'm just thinking, what about male priests then in temples which have the woman deity then? Hasn't anyone raised that issue? How could there be male priests?
That's great. That's great. I suggest you raise it right now and file a PIL. Absolutely, I think that's wonderful. But we're just so used to men having control over women's bodies that it doesn't strike us as being bizarre at all that the woman deity will have a male priest. Whereas we're so used to thinking of women as seductresses, that's the only role we see them playing when they enter Ayyappan's temple. But that's an excellent point. Yeah.
From that Jamali and Kamali's story, is there any written text in the history which you must have researched? I mean, apart from the rumors that they were friends or they were, what was your research showing that? What was the conclusion? And still, it's a mystery.
Yeah, it's always in the poetry. So all these people write poetic tracts. So the poem I was telling you about that Khusro writes when Nizamuddin dies. Another famous Khusro poem, Chap Tilak, and again many of you must have heard it. It's an extremely important ghazal. It basically says, you stole my heart with a look. You undressed me with a look. You made me wear green and red bangles on my arms, which is traditional for North Indian brides, just by looking at me. And Bulle Shah, for instance, with Shah Inayat, will keep saying, I'm going to teach myself how to dance because I know you like me when I dance. So I'm going to dance my way back to your favor. So we don't necessarily have books that say our sexuality. But we have several poetic, artistic instances on which we can base ideas of desire from this vantage point and think about what we might have gained, but especially what we might have lost.
One question I have about desire is that today we desire things like money.
Like money?
Yeah, which is seen as non-sexual, but I want to know how those kind of desires might define sexuality. Especially because you said in Europe, when they started in the 13th century, coming up with this new moral code, that was also the same time that money became something that became a means of transaction and also global trade. Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. One of the offshoots of my saying desire has a horizon of possibility that's not limited to and by the body means that we can think about desire in relation to things like money. And there is a very sort of superficial or banal understanding of it, which is money is almost always codified as belonging to a man who then owns objects that are coded female, right? Which is why cars are always called she, and all these objects of luxury are always coded she, so it becomes an extremely heterosexual phenomenon when sort of the male man will buy these female objects. So there is that sort of banal, not necessarily banal, but very clear sense of thinking about money sexually. And you know, if you see any films that talk about, you know, Wall Street or anything, the sort of eroticization of money is very much there. In as much as it is, when you said sort of morality coincided with the rise of money and with the rise of banking, what's fascinating to me, and again I've written about this here, is that the banking system in Europe, which starts out in Florence, borrows a concept from the Indian subcontinent without which they could not have succeeded, which is the concept of the zero. And the zero, of course, comes up in Arabia, India, around the same time, as early perhaps as the 5th century. The Europeans only get it through Arab traders in the 13th century, right? So they have no idea about the zero for 800 years. So you can imagine how sort of backward they are. And there is a sense in which the zero became really problematic for the Catholic Church, because the zero implies that there is a vacuum in God's creation, that there's a nothing. And so in many ways, the Catholic Church came down on the zero and banned merchants from using the zero, at the moment at which they were also banning homosexuality and prostitution and all this stuff. So I think it would be interesting to think about these as a continuum with one another, rather than as separate phenomena.
A tree would be a female gender or a male? Just a tree.
In which language?
In any
In
language?
French, yes.
No.
In English, no. There's no just a tree. In English, no.
Paid?
Paid is gendered, of course.
So it is a female or a male?
But I'm a good South Indian, so my genders in Hindi are not very good. What is paid? I think it's female. Yeah, male.
It's a male. And in English?
Non-gender. It's neutral.
It doesn't have a gender. Okay, thank you. So you cannot find a gender for a tree, actually.
In English. It depends on which language. You see, this is why language is so important as well. Yeah, in English you don't. But you know what's interesting is that did not make the English any easier with gender bending. Even though they spoke a language that was gender neutral, they were actually much worse than, say, Urdu speakers in India, whose language was extremely gendered, but whose sexual politics was far more egalitarian.
See the point that you were just talking about?
Yeah.
Where men and
Trees.
Men and the female side of desire as a car of XYZ.
Is a car. Oh, right, okay. I was.
When you use monographs like paise paid pe nahi hote.
And remember, a car in English is not gendered. It's we who have made it gendered. We call cities she. Why? Cars she. Why? Because we think of them as objects to be owned. My favorite example, i.e. the example I hate the most, Alexa. Why does it have a female name? Someone you give orders to do your bidding. Why? Right? And it's always a she. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, on that very happy note. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Madhavi, that was wonderful.